Hi, Mr. Richards here. Today's lesson is on percent and estimation. All right, I couldn't do that the entire lesson, so let's get back into my normal voice. One of the things we're going to do today is to estimate the percent of a number. Now, sometimes an exact answer is not needed when using percents. One way to estimate the percent of a number is to use a fraction. Another method for estimating the percent of a number is to first find 10% of the number, then multiply. So, for example, if we want to find 70%, we can find 10% and multiply by 7, since 7 times 10 is 70. So 70% equals 7 times 10% of a number. And as we look at our guided examples, Jody has paid 62% of the $500 she owes for her loan. Estimate 62% of 500. They use fractions in this example. So we're going to estimate 62% as 60%. Now, 60% is 6 over 10, or even if you needed to, 60 over 100. Either way, you can simplify this all the way down to 3/5. And if you take 3/5 times 500, you'll get about 300. So 62% of 500 is about 300. Marita and 4 of her friends ordered a pizza that cost $14.72. She is responsible for 20% of the bill. About how much money will she need to pay? Well, step 1, find 10% of 15. And again, this is an estimation question, about. So we can estimate $14.72 into $15. So if we find 10% of 15, one way of doing that, 10% as a decimal, well, if we move the decimal place back twice, is equal to 0.10, or simply 0.1. And so 0.1 times 15 is $1.50. And we have an excellent, excellent, excellent note right here. To multiply by 10%, move the decimal point one place to the left. And so you can notice where they did that. I hope you can notice where they did that right here with the $15. Whoops, didn't want that there. Let's try this one. With the $15, all they did to find 10% was to move the decimal place once to the left to get the $1.50. Now, you're not done yet because 10% was $1.50. We're looking for 20%. Well, 20% is 2 times 10, and so 2 times $1.50 is $3. So Marita should pay about $3. So to summarize all of that, finding 10% of 15 first, $1.50. Then 2 times 10% is 20%, so 2 times $1.50 is $3. And as we go over these examples and the got it questions, hopefully this will all make more sense. Estimate 42% of 120. Well, I'm going to come up here on the top of our work zone to show our work for this. And so for A, if we're looking to do 42% of 120, let's estimate now. Let's find 40% of 120. And let's use our fraction method for this. 40% as a decimal, or excuse me, as a fraction, is 40 over 100. Now, to simplify, let's start off by dividing by 10 on top and bottom. We end up with 4/10. Then, if we divide by 2 on top and bottom, we can end up with 2/5. So the first thing we did, we estimated 42% to 40%. Then we rewrote 40% as a fraction, which is 2/5. So now, if we can take that 2/5 and multiply by 120, 120 is 120 over 1. Now you could multiply straight across, then divide, Or, if we cross-simplify by dividing both the 5 and the 120 by 5, 5 divided by 5 is 1. 120 divided by 5 is 24. And so now as I finish, 2 times 24 is 48. 1 times 1 is 1. And so I have my answer. 42% of 120 is about 48. And that's one way to solve, using fractions. 42% was about 40%. 40% is 2/5, and 2/5 times 120 is 48. Let's move on to B. Dante plans to put 80% of his paycheck into a savings account and save the other 20%. His paycheck this week was $295. About how much money will he put into his savings account? The first thing I would do here is to identify which percentage we're looking for. They give us 2. They give us 80% into his savings and spending 20. We're looking for the percentage into his savings account, so we're looking for now the 80%. And so now if we come up to the top of our work zone here, or what we have left for our work zone, let's write out the problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to find 80% of his paycheck. That's what's going into the savings. And so 80% of his paycheck, that's $295, is what we're trying to solve. Except we have this lovely about word, so we can actually make it easier for ourselves and estimate. We're trying to find 80% of 300. We can estimate that 295 as about 300. And so now if we use this method over here, where we found 10% and then multiplied, the first thing we want to do is to find 10% of 300. And the way we're going to do that is write 10% as a decimal, which is 0.1, and we're going to multiply this by the 300. Well, that's going to equal, if we use our shortcut here to multiply by 10%, move the decimal point one place to the left. Right now, with the 300, our decimal point's right here. And if we go one spot to the left, it's going to end up there. So it's going to equal 30. 10% of 300 is 30. Now our second step here is to multiply. Now we found 10%. And right now, if we're looking for 80%, 8 times 10% is equal to the 80%. And so if we take 8 times what we found to be 10%, which was 30, that's going to be our estimated answer of $240. And that is our answer for 80% of 300. So what did we do? We looked at our problem to see that we were going to solve for 80% of 295. We estimated to do 80% of 300. We first found 10% of 300 by moving the decimal place one to the left to get 30. And since 8 times 10% is the 80% we're looking for, 8 times the 30 is getting us the answer of 240. As we continue on, what if we're looking for percents greater than 100 or less than 1? You can also estimate percents of numbers when the percent is greater than 100 or less than 1. So for example 3, or guided example 3, estimate 122% of 50. Well, if 122% is about 120%, and to find 120% of 50, what we can do is break it apart. Think that 120 is 100 plus 20. Well, 100% of 50 is easy. That's just 50. And then so what we're really looking for now is 20% of 50, and they solved that to be 10. And so 100% was 50, 20% was 10, and so 120% is about 60. All right, let's start there with our got it questions. I'm going to come on over to the side. 170 for C. And usually I edit those out, but let's just keep rolling. We're looking for 174% of 200. And so what we can do is first estimate this. Let's take this as 175% of 200. And now for this 175%, let's break it into 100% and 75%. Well, for our 100%, 100% of 200 is simply 200. Now for our 75%, what we can do, 75% as a fraction is 3/4. And so if we were to multiply 3/4 by the 200, you can write 200 over 1, cross simplify, divide both the 4 and the 200 by 4 to get 1 and 50. 3 times 50 is 150. And so last, if I add the 200, which was the 100%, plus the 150, which represents the 75%, we get an answer of 350 for part C. What about D? In question D, we are looking for 298% of 45. Why don't we go ahead and estimate that to be 300% of 45? Well, what we can do here is say, well, let's look for 100%. Well, 100% of 45 is equal to 45. And this is kind of a unique type of question because 100% times 3 is 300%. And so if I take the 45 times 3, that's going to get me 3 100% or 300%. And 45 times 3 is 15, carry the 1, 3 times 4 is 12, plus 1 is 135. So to estimate this, our answer is about 135. What if we want to move on to E? For E, our question is asking us to find 347% of 80. Let's estimate this 347% to be 350% of 80. Well, let's combine everything that we've done so far. We know that 100% of 80 is equal to 80. And if I multiply it by 3, we should know then that 300% is going to be 80 times 3 is 240. So that covers the 300%. What about the 50%? Well, 50% as a fraction is 50 over 100, which when simplified is 1/2. So if I take the 80 and multiply that by 1/2, half of 80 is equal to 40. So if I take my 300%, which was 240, and add it to my 50%, which was 40, I get an answer of 280. So it's really pretty neat how it all comes together. Now let's shift back to guided example 4. There are 789 7th grade students at Washington Middle School. About 1/4% of the 7th grade students have traveled overseas. Not too many. What is the approximate number of 7th grade students that have traveled overseas? Explain. Well, 1/4% is 1/4 of 1%. All right. 789 we can estimate to be 800. And so here's how we're going to find this. We're going to find 1% of 800 first. Now 10% we move the decimal over to the left once. 1% we're going to move it over to the left twice. And so as we move the decimal over twice, we get 8. So 1% of 800 is 8. Now remember, 1/4% is 1/4 of 1. And so if we take our 1% value, which was 8, and multiply it by 1/4, we'll get that 1/4%. 1/4 of 8 is 2. So out of all those students, 2 7th grade students have traveled overseas. Let's see if we can do this on our own. Do we got it? We'll find out. A county receives 3/4% of a state sales tax. About how much money would the county receive from a sale of a computer that cost $1,200? Well, what do we want to find now? We'll find 3/4% of, let's estimate, 1,000. So our first thing we're going to do is to find 1% of 1,000. Neat. Well, if I write down 1,000 times our 0.01, what we do here is we look at the decimal point, and for 1%, we're going to move it to the left once and twice. And so 1% of 1,000 is equal to 10. Now, once I have that 1% value, what we're going to do, we need to find 3/4 of 1%. So we're going to take that 10 and multiply it by 3/4. Well, the 10 I can write as 10 over 1. I can still cross-simplify by dividing by 2. I end up with 2 and 5. When I multiply across, 5 times 3 is 15. 1 times 2 is 2. And if I simplify 15 over 2, that is 7.5. And so what does this mean as a decimal? Well, 7.50, which in money terms is $7.50. So a county receives 3/4% of a state sales tax? Well, that amount from $1,020 is about $7.50. And as we finish our lesson with the 5th guided example, last year 639 students attended a summer camp. Of those who attended this year, 0.5% or 0.5% also attended summer camp last year. About how many students attended the summer camp 2 years in a row? Now, 0.5% is half of 1%. So what they did here was they found 1% of 639, or 1% of 600 is kind of what they found, and they've got 6. Remember, 1% moved the decimal place twice to the left, and they got about 6. Now, 6 was 1%, 0.5% is half of that, So they found half of 6 to get 3. So out of the 639 students, about 3 attended summer camp 2 years in a row. And that is it for this lesson, lesson number 2 in our second chapter on percent and estimation. Good luck, y'all!